This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages.
Welcome to Sismic, a podcast about a fast-changing world.
What is real? How do you define real?
Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
It's about everyone. It's about all of us. It's about potential. It's about possibility.
The singularity is probably the right word because we just don't know what's going to happen.
How dare you!
Tom, thanks for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Tom, you founded On Purpose more than 10 years ago, and we'll talk about this more in depth, but you founded it with a mission to create an economy that works for all, like one that is healthy, fair, sustainable in the long term, right? So before we go into how this actually works, I'd like to understand how you look at things, when it comes to making sense of how the world works. I know it's a big question, but you are an adept of what we call system thinking, right? And maybe this is a good way to start the conversation by explaining what is system thinking and how you look at it.
Yes, of course, yeah. And thank you very, very much, Julien, for having me on your podcast. I've I guess in the last few years really come across the discipline of systems thinking. And I find it a hugely interesting and powerful way to look at, well, all kinds of things, actually, how the world works, and how all kinds of different things within the world work as well. I also believe strongly that it is at the cutting edge of where science is these days. After all, systems is kind of how the world is made, is what the world is made of. We are systems ourselves as human beings. We are made up of systems, be that cells or bacteria that live within us. The organizations that many of us work in are systems. The economy as a whole is a system. So actually, systems is how the world works. And maybe just briefly to describe in very basic terms what a system is and why it's a slightly different way of looking at things. A system is very simply a set of elements that interact with each other for a purpose, essentially. And what's slightly different about that is that it takes into account more explicitly that point of interaction, of those relationships that happen between elements of a system. And elements of a system could be people in an organization, it could be cells in your body, it could be microchips in a computer as well. And that kind of interaction is actually what in kind of more classical physics, for example, Newtonian physics, is often left out. And that is also what gives rise to, the complex behaviors that we see in systems. That's why we as humans are so complex. That's why the economy is complex, why nature is complex. So having a kind of way of thinking, what we call systems thinking, that can take account of this and can understand maybe a little bit more about where this complexity comes from, I think is really exciting and really helpful.
Okay, so then, how do you apply system thinking to understanding the world dynamics right now? What are the glasses or angles that you use to make sense of the complexity, to see through the clutter? And maybe to give you an example, one of the system I like to use is to try to understand the world and what's happening overall when we look at the news through different waves that are coming together. One big wave could be technology, another big wave could be society and culture, another wave is politics and power dynamics, and also like how nature as a system, is evolving. And nature, as we know, with everything that's going on in the world, is becoming a system that we had a little bit forgotten, that's being reminded to us, right? How do you look at things?
Well, I think the important thing in systems thinking is to understand that a lot of these things, or all these things really, are connected and they are interdependent. So we might historically think about, the technology wave, and then we think about the social change, and we think about the change in nature. But what systems thinking helps us do is to encourage us and realize that these things are connected. So a change in technology might mean that we start using resources differently. And that in turn then might mean that because we're using resources differently, we're impacting differently on nature. And similarly, technology means that we as humans interact differently with each other because we're using this technology differently. So actually these things all interact with each other and have effects on each other. Now, obviously, this can start getting very, very complex and very complicated. And it's why sometimes we as humans are not very good at thinking about systems and how systems might react. But I think the interesting and exciting news is that, systems thinking has been going since about the middle of the 20th century now as a kind of, as its own discipline. And what's really exciting is that systems thinkers have now started to kind of uncover what you might call almost kind of universal characteristics of how systems work. Whether these are natural systems or human-made systems, they've started to understand how do systems behave, and especially how do healthy systems behave? How do systems that are going to be able to maintain themselves indefinitely, that are going to be sustainable, what do those look like? And it's now possible to kind of look at certain characteristics and across all kinds of systems say, probably this system is kind of not very healthy because it's not conforming to this kind of characteristics. Just to maybe give you a very couple of small examples to make it a bit more tangible. We know, for example, that in healthy systems, resources get spread around to every part of the system. And now, if you think about that, if you think of our human body as a system and our blood as being a way of moving around the resources within our body, blood gets circulated to every part of the system. But you can think about that at very different levels as well. So if you think about our countries or our economies and politics, how well do we distribute resources, economic resources or other resources for that matter, around all our countries? And then you kind of might come to some different conclusions about how healthy that is. That's just one example of one of these principles of what healthy systems look like. And what's exciting is that this is actually derived from observation. So it's essentially a scientific observation.
So maybe we can go and look at one of the system within the entire system, which is the economy, right? It's part of our daily life. It's part of the system, but it's also a system in itself. So how do you see the role of the economy within that global system that we're looking at, and how much it matters when it comes to actually understanding, why things are how they are in the world today?
Sure. Well, the economy is critically important. And interestingly, I think often when we hear the word economy, we switch off slightly because it feels abstract, it feels complicated, it feels maybe very technical. But actually, when you think about it, what the economy really is, it's how we have chosen to organize ourselves to produce all the goods and services that we all need to live. And I use choose quite deliberately. There are actually different ways of doing this, but currently we have an economy that is the product of a whole bunch of choices we have made over a long time period. So, and that, by the way, includes not just the products and services that we use and pay for, which is what some more traditional economists usually include, but it also actually includes all the kind of unpaid goods and services that we use. That might be cooking a meal for your family, which you don't get paid for, but it's still something that we need to live. Or it might be, in some situations, looking after your children or bringing up your children, which often is an unpaid activity as well if it's carried out within the activity within a family, for example. So once you start realizing that the economy is kind of how we organize to get all those things done, then you realize that it really impacts everyone, and it impacts everyone at a very personal and very important level. I think the second thing it does is that it starts explaining a little bit, and I'm sure we'll come into this in more detail, why the economy and nature are so intertwined and so interrelated. There's a principle in systems thinking that systems are often nested within each other. So I've already talked briefly about the fact that, we as humans are a system, as a human body that is made up of systems like cells. It's made up of systems like organs, like your liver, your heart, but also your nervous system. We as humans might be part of an organization, which in turn is also a system. So there's this kind of nesting effect going on. And this nesting effect applies to the economy as well. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the economy is actually a subsystem of nature. And once you...
Well, you can argue that pretty much everything is a subsystem of nature, right?
Yeah, ultimately, that's probably true. But once you realize that, then you start understanding why the economic decisions we make have such a big impact on our natural environment as well. One nice way of thinking about it is that, which I've heard people talk about, is that, nothing that we produce and sell hasn't in some shape or form been given us by nature for free. If you think about it, every material thing we sell, whether it's a table, whether it's a computer, ultimately we took and got some resource for nature for free. Even actually if it's what we're selling is time or as a service, again, that comes from our own energy and time, and that again is fed by nature through food and so on. So there is this very actually tight interaction between the economy and nature, which again in classical economics is not always acknowledged.
Yeah, which we tend to forget. Actually, we tend to forget that everything has some kind of a physical component to it, or energy component to it, if it's not directly physical goods, right? So, I'd like to stay on the economy a little bit, because some say that the way the economy works today is totally fine, right? And this version that we have now of globalized financial capitalism, or you can find other names, right? Neoliberalism, for example. Mm-hmm. This version is working well to foster human development, and that the solutions to all the challenges of our time, like climate change, to just name one, can be found within this economic model. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And some other people think, on the contrary, that the current economic model will not allow us to find solutions, or even worse, is really at the root of the problems that we have. What's your take on this? And first, how would you define the current economic model? And then how healthy do you think this is, to help answering these questions?
Sure. So, the current economic model that has evolved over the past couple of 100 years or so has clearly been very powerful in many ways. And people often point to, lots and lots of people around the world being lifted out of poverty. And that's clearly a big impact it's had. But it has also clearly landed us in a situation where we face this climate catastrophe, and we face a whole bunch of other social challenges as well, whether they be around inequality, working poor, etc., etc. I find that trying to think about the economy as a system as a whole is often quite overwhelming. And so I tend to use a little bit of a metaphor. And the metaphor is the following. Imagine just for a minute that your body represents an economy. So your own kind of human body was the sum total of an economy. All the cells in your body represent organizations who are producing services and goods that you need. The blood, as we've already mentioned, is circulating all the resources, the raw materials, the money around your body. You have a nervous system that is conducting data and information all over the place. And like in the real economy as well, you derive your energy from the food and the sunlight that you gain ultimately from nature. So you can kind of see that there are some nice parallels that you can draw, and hopefully it brings it back to a system that we're a little bit more familiar with in our kind of day-to-day lives. Now, I would say that if we were to make a health check of this kind of economic body of ours, we would come very quickly to the slightly startling and maybe slightly shocking conclusion that we are suffering from an advanced stage of cancer. Now, I realize this is a slightly sensitive topic for some people and a very personal topic to many people, but I think it's also actually one that is quite useful to think about, because it lets us learn a little bit about what might be going on. So
I guess that's a powerful metaphor. So maybe if you can go through why you call it a cancer. Yeah.
If you think about what happens in a cancer, you have a cell where some of the DNA, the genes in that cell mutate. That cell then, for some reason, manages to, because of these mutations, to set itself free from some of the growth controls in your body, and it starts growing. It starts growing very fast, and it starts growing in a kind of out of control fashion. That goes on for a while. Maybe some more mutations occur, and it starts becoming becomes the size of a tumor. And after a while, that tumor will start becoming not just a benign tumor, but a malignant tumor, which means that it starts infecting other cells around about it. So it isn't just growing itself, but it's starting to change the way other cells around about it behave as well. Then as tumors become very big in your body, you start getting a process of angiogenesis, which means that a tumor starts, because it's growing so fast, it has to suck in resources from all over your body. And that actually means that some other parts of your body can almost get slightly starved of the resources they need. By the way, that's one of the reasons why patients with advanced cancer often start losing weight because of this process called angiogenesis. And, the next step can be that you get metastasis, which you've probably heard about. The tumor breaks off, goes to another part of the body. You get the picture. And obviously, after a while, what can happen is that the cancer starts affecting the vital systems in your body. And then, of course, it can become irreversible. Now, what does this tell us about the economy? Well, and why do I think that the economy, it's fair to say that we see cancerous behaviors in our economy as well? Well, I hope some of the parallels you will be already drawing in your mind as we speak, but I think you can point to organizations and companies that have kind of loosed themselves from growth controls, that are growing for growth's sake, whose purpose has changed, rather than like a healthy cell trying to do its part to
maintain the entire system,
to maintain the healthy system. What it's doing is it's just going for its growth sake. It's that you can see situations where companies are in inverted commas infecting other companies with that type of way of working. They're taking over other parts of the economy. They are sucking in disproportionate amounts of resources as well, as you can see, for example, in the UK, when you look at some of how finances and how new money that is created gets allocated to different industries and so on. So a huge amount gets sucked into very few industries. So there are lots of parallels that can be drawn.
That's very interesting also, because that's also looking at the place of the human activity on this planet, because you have this entire ecosystem that you can look at as a body, which is the planet, right? The nature. And you have that species like humans that are behaving very differently. So you can also look at the entire system and how human behavior can be seen as a cancer, when you look at nature overall, right? To stay on the economy, what needs to change? What are the most important levers? Is it about regulation? Is it about new ways of looking at things, measuring things? Some say it's about innovation, about consumer behavior, about culture. I know it's really not a simple question, and there is not one simple solution, but how would you rank things? What are the deep roots that we really need to look at?
Yeah. In many ways, it's about all of the things that you just mentioned. And the question is, what is the common thing that we need to think about amongst all of those? I sometimes use kind of an iceberg metaphor, which you might be familiar with. 90% of the iceberg is below the waterline. You can't see it. And yet, often what we focus on is the bit that we can see, which in this kind of metaphor represents the behaviors. What is often below the waterline are the kind of the reasons for those behaviors, the underlying values, the underlying mindsets, the worldviews that we have. And I actually think that it's those things that we need to think about. And we can come back to the cancer metaphor here a little bit as well, which is, I think, helpful. If you think about what is the root cause of cancer, it is the mutations that happen in your genes. There are thousands of mutations happen every day. Most of them have no effect whatsoever. Some of them are positive. Occasionally you get one that is negative and might lead you a little bit closer to cancerous behavior. That happens. What then happens is that feedback loops in your cell get loosened. The growth controls get loosened. And then thirdly, what can happen ultimately is that the purpose of that cell changes. So from going, as we talked about, from being a cell that is trying to play its role in maintaining a healthy body, it becomes a cell that is trying to grow as big as it possibly can, for its own sake. So the three things. And you then think about, okay, what's the equivalent of that in our economy? The change in mutations in genes for me is the kind of real root cause. And that is if you think about it, the change of that is the change in our fundamental values. The genes represent our values, the values which are very fundamental, underlying how we run our economy. They are the unquestioned assumptions we make, the stories we tell each other. And these, like our genes have been mutating over a certain amount of time, these values have been mutating over hundreds of years as well. And somehow we have ended up in a situation now where we have a kind of set of values, a worldview or a paradigm is the slightly more technical view, which is allowing this kind of, if you like, this cancerous behavior to happen.
Some could call it culture, right?
Yes, it certainly has a big effect on our culture because it affects, as I say, the kind of narrative that we have, what we see as being success, what we aspire to. These things are all kind of closely intertwined. And ultimately, therefore, I think what we need to do, or one of the three things we need to do, is to work on those values. If we try and change the economy by only kind of trying to change, as it were, the symptoms or the behaviors, what is above the waterline in the iceberg model, I don't think that's actually really going to get us to where we need to be. We need to be brave enough to go down and think about those deeper things, which are quite fundamental questions like what is success? Why do we do what we do? What are those fundamental values and stories that we tell each other that shape ultimately how our economy works and how the organizations work within our economy as well?
Okay, so I mean that's very clear. And I think what I find interesting is that you really go deep, right? It's about individual behavior that's building collective behavior and collective thinking. I would like to talk about what you do now. About your organization On Purpose. What is this approach that you're taking to changing, how the economy works? I guess it's related to what you just said, but I'd like to understand, what is purpose about, and why you think it can make a difference? Yeah, sure.
Let me tell you briefly what we kind of do very tangibly On Purpose, and then I'll tell you a little bit how that relates, I guess, to what we've just been talking about. So at On Purpose, we run a 1-year full-time leadership program. We take people who have realized that they want to, in their career, make sure that they have a purpose and are doing meaningful work, and maybe feel at the moment that this isn't happening. They hopefully find out about us, they apply to us, and if they get in, they quit their job, and they come to us for a year full time, and we organize 4 things for them. 2 6-month placements, where they are working on a paid basis in 2 different organizations, in a very wide range of organizations. But the common factor is always that they are trying to think about how do you more intelligently integrate social, commercial, environmental ways of working. So in some ways, it's maybe taking a little bit more of this kind of systems type of approach. We have half a day week of training every Friday afternoon, and we have lots of one-to-one support as well, through mentoring and coaching. So people kind of experience the real world of what it's like to try and make some of this change happen. They can get the skills that they need to do that and the support. And really importantly, they can kind of get their tribe. They have the support of the cohort of the people who are going on this journey with them together as well. And of course, what happens during this year is that they get exposed to essentially the fact that you can run organizations according to a different set of values. And this happens in all kinds of different organizations. There are initiatives happening in organizations or different organizations being set up that are trying to operate according to different values, which are interesting, which conform maybe to a healthier economy than the kind of traditional way of doing that. We can also talk about the mindset change that the associates go through, our participants go through over the year. And so ultimately, what you end up with is someone who has been exposed to and has hopefully also taken in some of those deeper changes in their values, in their fundamental values at a personal level, but has also thought about that at the organizational level and is working to make some of those changes happen. When they then leave the program, they kind of go out and work in a whole range of different organizations. But we think in a way, hopefully what we've done is that we have, if I go back to the cancer metaphor, in a way infected these people with a slightly different way of thinking about the world, a different set of values. And they will go out and they will make this kind of change happen in whatever organization they are in. by, working with the colleagues around them, role modeling that there are different ways of doing things, helping to change the organizations. And this then adds to a kind of a building of healthier values. If you like, in a way, it's almost a little bit like gene therapy. We are taking people, trying to mutate their genes within them, make sure that they're exposed to different values. And then we go and insert them, for the rest of their careers into different organizations where they can multiply and replicate that way of thinking amongst their colleagues, and obviously then contribute to making great change happen. So that's what we do in the program, and roughly how that works.
Okay, so building kind of an army of change agents.
Yeah, in many ways that you can think of it that way.
Army may not be the right word, but how should the way we build organizations evolve, and to go back to what you just said, can these actually be done by just showing up to work with a different mindset, or are there some more really structural barriers to changing organizations or overall?
Yeah, sure. There are obviously structural barriers as well, and there are big challenges, and there are entrenched interests. There is, regulation, laws, all kinds of things which can be positive or negative. But ultimately, I think, unless we do come with a different mindset, it's not going to work. But what's important is that it's not just about changing our individual mindsets. Ultimately, we need to try and help bring about a kind of more collective mindsets, because it's that collective mindset which then over time will actually start tackling some of these barriers that you talk about as well. And if we manage to make some of those changes happen at different levels at the same time, so if we change mindsets in individuals, if we can then change kind of values, if you like, that organizations are run by, and ultimately also the kind of approach to the economy and politics at a higher level. If we can start making changes happening at all those levels simultaneously, then actually change will happen quite quickly. And the various barriers will start getting removed at different levels simultaneously. And if that happens together, then change can happen actually quite quickly. And that's why I think at On Purpose, we think of this kind of collective angle as being very important. And that, you're not doing this journey just by yourself. Because at the moment, if you go out into an organization and you want to make change happen, you have maybe, you have realized there are different ways of doing things. You go into an organization, it can be quite lonely, depending on what that organization is. But often people can run out of energy or run out of steam. And that's why, this element of community is so important. And that's one thing that we foster at On Purpose. You're not just part of a community for part of the year that you're with us, but that community carries on for the rest of your career, actually. And you have a set of like-minded people who can support you, who can challenge you, who can help you. Now, we are, of course, not the only community doing this. There are lots of other exciting communities doing this as well. And of course, it needs that, because this needs to be a really big movement. But ultimately, I think of it sometimes a little bit like different kind of droplets of water that are forming. Our community is a little droplet. Next door is another community that's forming. Ultimately, these droplets, there'll be so many of them that they will start coalescing, and you can very quickly start getting quite a big stream. And that's ultimately how I think of how change will happen.
What's your take on economical growth in a finite world, in times where we are already beyond the limits of our planet? A purposeful economy, I'd like to clarify also what it means, because if it's growing in value, can it be purposeful for the planet? Where do you put the boundaries between what's good for society, what's good for the environment? What's your take on this?
Sure. Ultimately, my take is that, and this is another kind of principle of systems thinking, is that it has to be good for the planet and the economy and the organizations and ourselves. You can't have what's good for the economy without it also being good for the planet, ultimately. Because if it's bad for the planet, it's going to be bad for the economy, and that's going to be bad for us as individuals as well. So actually, it's back to this point that it's all interrelated and interdependent. Now, obviously, people, I think it's obvious that, we live on a finite planet. There are physical boundaries to that in terms of the resources that we can extract, also boundaries in terms of the sinks that we can use up. So you can think of that as how we pollute things. And the carbon sink is obviously the one that's most talked about, but there are many other ones as well. So it's clear that we, at least at that kind of physical material level, we can't have infinite growth, or certainly not at the kind of rate that we're trying to do at the moment. Now, some people think that you can decouple that kind of growth, or that you can decouple growth from that kind of material or physical effect on nature. And maybe that's true, but there are also many people who I respect who think that is not really ever going to be possible. And I think, in a precautionary way, if we're being serious about this, we probably should assume that it's may not be possible to the extent that we think. Because if it doesn't work this time, if we get to kind of 20 years time, we go, oops, we haven't managed to decouple.
It doesn't work.
It's going to be a little bit too late. So, but I think more fundamentally, I think there's a more interesting question, or more important point here, which is, talking about growth is in a way the wrong answer to the wrong question. This should not be about whether we think growth is possible or not, because that implies still that we think growth is essentially the goal. We still think that growth is what is needed to make us successful. Growth is what is needed to make us happy. Growth will create jobs. Growth will create wealth, all those kind of things. Actually, what we need to think about is, how do we create a healthy system, a healthy economy within a healthy natural world, and actually healthy lives for us as individuals within that as well. And, growth was actually only ever a proxy measure for trying to create that. And it turns out it's been a pretty bad proxy measure. Actually, it has all kinds of unintended consequences. So I think we need to get back to more directly thinking about what is the real goal, which is, how do we create an economy that allows everyone to live a kind of fulfilled and dignified and meaningful life, and where we can do that within the boundaries of our planet. And that's where the system thinking comes in again. The systems thinking, and what do healthy systems look like? If we know that in a healthy system, like I said, for example, the resources get distributed to all parts of the system, let's make sure that happens. If we know that in a healthy system, in order for any part of the system genuinely to be healthy and well, actually all parts of the system need to be healthy and well. If we really understand that and really grapple that will make us come up with some really different answers. If we know that in a healthy system, resources get reused multiple times, we get as much out of them as we can, then again, that leads us to all kinds of different ways of thinking, both about our economy and about how we run organizations. That last point, in fact, there's a lot of kind of positive stuff happening, because that is essentially what the circular economy is doing. So that's one really interesting space where the circular economy, I think, is living principles that are directly in line with some of these healthy principles of systems. We just need to kind of find that type of innovation in lots of other places as well.
Yeah, and to go back to the notion of growth, it's also, when you take a step back, it's also surprising to see how we really associate this term growth with the economy only, right? Because you could argue that there are many other things that you could grow. You could grow, the level of literacy. You can want to grow the level of connection with people, the level of knowledge. Like there are plenty of other things that you want to be growing and that need to grow. It's just that the way we define growth is by the growth of amount of money in the system, right? I don't know. It's to me, it sounds, as you were saying, it's like we talk about growth as if it has only one definition.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And the interesting thing about some of the things that you just mentioned is that growth in some of those cases doesn't imply a kind of zero-sum game. If we think about growing money in the system, ultimately some people get that money and other people don't get that money. And you can then argue about how fairly is that distributed. If you think about growing relationships, which is one of the things that you just mentioned, which actually is an important thing, because the kind of epidemic of loneliness, certainly in the Western world, is terribly sad. If you think about growing relationships, you can grow relationships obviously without material input, so it doesn't affect nature in that sense. But also, it's one of those interesting things where if two people come together and form a friendship, that friendship benefits both of those people. You are not exchanging something. In a classic economic exchange, I give you money, you give me goods, and thereby we've exchanged something. But actually, a friendship is something where two people come together and they create something between them that benefits both of them. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's a slightly philosophical point, but I think there are some other examples like that as well, which will ultimately make us all wealthier, maybe not in money terms, but in many other ways.
I guess there would be a lot to say related to understanding, how and what we measure, really matters, and how we look at the system, the equations we build are defining how we understand the world, right?
Exactly. It's what we measure. It's what we see success as being, and ultimately, it's what we value. And what we value, if you excuse the pun, comes very quickly back to what our values are. And that's why, that's why it's important to think at this kind of quite deep level. And that sometimes can feel very overwhelming, and it feels like that's going to take a long time, and how are we ever going to change that? But actually, certainly here in the UK, and I think certainly in other parts of Western Europe at least, and I'm sure in other parts of the world as well, there's a recent example of where this has changed incredibly quickly. The use of plastics has, over just a couple of years, suddenly become something which people have, I think, created a whole different value set around. Suddenly companies are trying to reduce plastic in their packaging. Fast food outlets and coffee shops are not giving you plastic cutlery anymore, or plastic lids. You take in your own coffee to the coffee shop. That is essentially a values change that has happened. Okay, it's happened in quite a specific and a relatively small area, but it's happened incredibly quickly. And that gives me kind of real hope and excitement that can happen in other places as well.
It has to start somewhere, right?
Exactly.
Well, last month you published an article declaring climate emergency and explaining how the context has changed since you created On Purpose 10 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, of course. So we declared a climate emergency together with and through an organization or a network of organizations called Business Declares, who are trying to make sure that organizations and businesses are taking this climate emergency very seriously and trying to lead by example. What it basically involves is that we have committed to going carbon neutral by 2025. So that's quite soon. I have to admit, we don't yet know how we're going to do that, but we're going to figure out how to make it happen. And essentially, if you think about the situation we're in, the time that we have to try and make a difference, the IPCC has said there is about 10 years in which to make a significant difference to the climate. Then, we ended up, it actually became a very simple decision for us, because we asked ourselves, well, if we as an organization and what we stand for are not going to take this stand, how can we expect other people to do this? So we declared a climate emergency. As I say, we don't yet fully know how we're going to make this happen, but we're going to try very hard and we're going to make it happen. And again, I think it's important we're doing it together with a set of other companies, trying to create a little bit of a movement and energy, stimulate other people to join as well. And like we do that with the associate program, we think as doing that at the organizational level is also very important.
Cool. I'll put a link on the page of the podcast to this article.
Wonderful. Thank you.
What do you think of the next 10 to 20 years? You just talked about the fact that we need to do something very quickly over the next 10 years, but what do you think will be actually happening? What gives you hope and what scares you?
Yeah. So I think what scares me is that we underestimate the speed of change that is necessary, that we don't see the tipping points coming, both in our kind of natural environment, but also actually in our social environment, in our society, where things, are being eroded, and you can go into tipping points as well that are very difficult to recover from. And that people don't accept that the change that we need to make happen is quite fundamental. I think there is a risk that we try and mitigate the symptoms, if you like, of our economic system and what's going wrong, rather than that we try and tackle the more fundamental things like the values that we've talked about. And we can't afford to waste this crisis. 10 years ago, we had an economic crisis with the financial meltdown. And I think at the time, one kind of possible silver lining was people were saying, well, maybe at least this will lead to some reform. And actually, I think the reforms that have come from that have been much smaller than I would have hoped, and maybe other people hoped as well. I think we need to make sure that the situation we're facing now is really, that we really make sure that the change that happens is big enough and is fundamental enough. On the flip side, what gives me hope, though, is that these kind of values that need to change. One really interesting thing that I read about values is that values are a little bit like muscles, like the muscles in our body. The more that you use a muscle, the stronger it gets. And the more that we practice a value, the stronger it gets as well. And conversely, the less we use a value, the weaker it will get. And so you can think of it this way. We have, a set of values that maybe currently are dictating a lot of how our economy works and that are not very healthy. And we're using them a lot, and so they're getting reinforced. If we can stop using those a little bit, start using some healthier values a little bit more, that every little bit that we use, it will reinforce that positive value as well. So values in that sense are like muscles. They have positive feedback loops or reinforcing feedback loops built into them. And reinforcing feedback loops, again, they're a kind of part of systems thinking. And they mean that change can actually happen really, really quickly. And it's always happens surprisingly quickly, more quickly than we might think. So that's what gives me hope. A little bit like the plastic example we talked about, actually change can happen quickly. And if we're all thinking about that, trying to make sure that we're genuinely, as it were, using this crisis for the right things, then I think we can come out in a much better place.
It's also interesting, how you can see also what's happening in many different countries as a fight between different type of values. Like the more blatant example is the US right now, where you have clearly very much conservative values versus very progressive values, and kind of extreme in both ends of the spectrum, right? And you can argue that the reality of the next 5 to 10 years will depend on what are the values that dominate and really take the power, right? But it's interesting to see the conversation, how it's really different worldviews that are fighting against each other.
Yes, I think that's true. What I'd add to that is that, this kind of, in a way, the worldviews that you've just shown us, that there's been this kind of tug of war between whatever you want to call it, socialism and neoliberalism, or more conservative forms of economics for the past 100 years, socialism and capitalism, etc. But what I think is, and in many ways that has been going on for a long time, and I don't think it's just about whether one or the other of these is right. I actually think we need a genuinely different lens to look at this through. And that is, I think, what this kind of systems thinking approach allows us to do. Interestingly, when you look at some of the consequences and some of the implications of thinking about it in a systems way, you come up with answers and solutions that you can't necessarily classify as being whatever you want to call it, socialist or neoliberal. They are actually somewhere in between, or they are a genuinely different way of thinking about things. And that's what I think is important. In some ways, we actually need to get away from that dichotomy of that kind of political spectrum. And we need to think about the world and the economy and nature and how we operate our organizations in a genuinely different way. Kind of put that very stale argument to one side and say, okay, if we genuinely want to create an economy that works, we genuinely want to have organizations that are part of a healthy economy, we need to start from a different starting point. And that is, I think, what this kind of systems type approach gives us.
And this is what I like with complex system, is that it shows that the issue is actually complex. It's not black or white, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just say a little bit on the economy. How long do you think the current economic system can last, without being reformed in depth? Did you see it collapsing, as some people say or think, at some point, or being reformed, from within, or continue this way despite all the externalities, until everything ends, basically?
So, I mean, one easy answer to that is that the IPCC has told us that we have about 10 years to make real change happen for the benefit of the environment. And if we don't, then, okay, there won't be collapse in 10 years' time. But if we don't make those changes happen in the next 10 years, then there will be collapse in future, whether that is 50 years away or 100 years away. So we don't have very much time. And in that sense, we are living in awesome times, and I mean that in the original sense of the word, but also maybe in the more colloquial sense of the word. These are exciting, important, and critical times. They are times of change and unrest. They are times of an old system breaking down and a new system being formed. And again, that can happen actually ultimately quite quickly. And what we need to do is to make sure that the new system that does kind of emerge from this process is a healthy one for all of us as individuals, for nature, for our economy, and the organizations we work in. So we don't have much time to do it in, but that's probably a good thing, because the clock is ticking and change needs to happen. And in many ways, these crises that are going on are going to spur, relatively quick action, and they are in a way going to loosen up the system. Some of the old structures in the system, some of the entrenched interests are almost going to get stirred up and loosened up, which will make it easier actually to make change happen. We just need to make sure that the change does happen is hopefully built on a solid and healthy foundation.
What is the one important thing that is often overlooked, or misunderstood related to all this, and that everyone should look at?
I think one thing that people often forget is that actually, if we manage to create a better system, it's going to be a happier place. It's going to be a place with greater well-being for all of us. Often I think people hear about the changes that they think they need to make, and I think it's about sacrificing something. It's about not having whatever products that they want. It's about not having the luxury that they want or whatever. And yes, it might be true that we need to give some of those things up. But actually, in reality, some of those things that you think you might need to give up and that you might be worried about are not necessarily the things that are making us truly happy.
You mean a new iPhone every year?
For example, yeah. A new iPhone every year that we think connects us to our friends and neighbors and family, when actually what we might need is real physical connection and seeing people in relationships with the people that we live and our neighbors and all that kind of thing. So ultimately, I also work for an organization that has a slogan that, what is good for the planet is also good for us. And I also think that applies to the economy. What is good for a healthy economy ultimately will be good and healthy for us. It will mean that, we will be happy, or we will have well-being in different ways, because we will think about our success and our happiness and our well-being in different ways. But ultimately, this is actually a better place to end up in. And it's not about the kind of hair shirt. It's not about sacrifice. This is genuinely thinking about, okay, guys, we've got an opportunity to think, how do we kind of construct how we organize ourselves, our society and our economy in a way that is genuinely going to work for everybody.
So what would you do if you were in a situation of power, be it prime minister or of, I don't know where is the power actually, but, or you had a magic trick. What's the most important thing to do ideally that could make a difference?
Sure. I would change the story. I would change the story that we tell each other about actually about why we exist, even about what success is and what makes us happy as individuals and collectively. And then I'd make sure that we all know that that kind of happiness and success and well-being is actually only going to work if we all manage to achieve it to some extent. You know, this kind of idea of having winners and losers in an economy, or on our planet, if you think about species and so on, it is not going to work. You know, a fundamental piece of systems thinking and of healthy systems is that you can't have an overall healthy systems if any part of your system is not healthy. Equally, you know, any part of your system can't really be healthy unless the whole system overall is healthy as well. So we need to change the story and the narrative about what success, what health, what happiness, what well-being is at the individual, the organizational, and the societal level. And if we can do that and realize that we need to kind of get there collectively, then real change can happen.
And I guess I have another question related to applying this to the corporate world, you know, professional systems, right? What would be your piece of advice, or I guess the piece of advice you give to the people around you for the professional looking for a purposeful path? You know, how do you see our responsibility at a corporate level?
Sure. Well, of course, one option for a professional looking for a purposeful path is to check out onpurpose.org and see what we do. But more seriously, you know, so that's one option. But you know, actually, we need to have professionals who are acting with purpose in all organizations, in all walks of life. And I think one thing to keep in mind is to ask yourself those deeper questions around purpose. And purpose, as we think about it on Purpose, is around what are you contributing to the wider world, if you like, to the wider systems around you. How are you doing that as an individual? And are you making those systems healthier or less healthy? And then also think about that at the organizational level. You know, what is your organization genuinely contributing to the wider system? You know, positive and negative. What is the net impact you are having on the wider system? If you are a food company, what overall impact are you having on the food system? What overall impact are you having on the economic system? And ultimately, what overall impact are you having on the natural system? Now, trying to figure that out as an individual is not necessarily easy, and you won't be able to kind of analyze it and come up with the, inverted commas, the right answer. But at least trying to engage with that, I think, is one important point. And then thinking about, okay, what can my role be in making even a little change and a little shift in that direction happen? The second thing I'd say is that, you know, I'm a firm believer in trying things out, in running little experiments. You know, systems are so complex that we can't predict what is going to happen when we do. We just have to try and make some changes and see what happens, and whether those changes then kind of lead in the right direction. And that can be the case for kind of an organization overall and how we manage that. It can also be a case for our careers as individuals, and think, what if I do a little bit of this? What if I go and volunteer in that organization over there? You know, let's see how I feel about that. Does that give me energy? Does that really inspire me? Or was that maybe not quite the right thing? Often we find people coming into the program who want to find a more meaningful career, but they have this kind of quite deep desire to do this, but and this is no bad thing, you know, they haven't yet worked out exactly what that is. And they're often trying to work it out in quite an intellectual way. And I always say to them, actually, ultimately, the way to really understand these things is to work it out in an experiential and in an intuitive way as well. So go out, meet some people, do some experiments. Try something different in your job, talk to your colleagues about whether they want to get involved in some kind of initiative that you think would be purposeful, make things happen, and then see what works for you. You know, what gives you energy, what has the right kind of outcomes, what is exciting. Ultimately, I think that's what we need to do at the individual level, actually also at the organizational and even at the economic level as well.
So, I mean, as we're speaking, like, I've got a question that comes to me. I mean, the thing that I was always wondering related to this big change that's needed, and that I hear a lot of people, you know, debating, is what type of values do we need actually to be working on and to teach our kids? Is it too late, basically, to build these values of a healthy, society around equality, around empathy, or do we need actually to build values around a very different type of future, very different world, where things will be scarce, where things will get more violent? There is a big debate within even the people that are aware of all these issues. Like, do we need to build things for a collapsing world, or do we need to fight for it not to collapse? In short.
Well, it's a big question. My view on that is that we can't give up on trying to build a healthy world. I think we can't be naive on the fact that we have to prepare for some adaptation as well. I think I'd rather use the word adaptation than collapse. So let's do that. But I don't think we can make that our main bet. I think we still need to try and make sure that we are working towards a kind of what I would call a healthy economy and a healthy world. Yes, let's not be naive. Let's make sure that we do the adaptation as well. But when we think about the adaptation, what I think is also crucially important is that we make sure that that is a kind of just adaptation. People talk now about a just transition when they talk about the kind of energy markets and going towards sustainable energy and making sure that those benefits are shared between everybody. I think if we're going to think about adaptation, we also need to make sure that we end up with a just way of adapting to a new world, if that's going to be necessary. I don't think it's an option to think that we're going to end up in a kind of Hunger Games scenario where essentially the rich have adapted in a way that works quite nicely for them, and those who don't have the power or the resources end up, literally kind of without the place to live or the means to support themselves or the food or whatever it might be. So in the same way that we need to, I think, make sure that we change our values to create a healthy economy, we need to make sure that the values that we are using to think about adaptation that may need to happen are also going to create a healthy adaptation, one that works for everybody and one that works as far as possible for nature.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I think it's very enlightening because there are a lot of questions related to how positive we should be or must be, right? And there is a lot of conversation, for example, a lot of related to what Greta Thunberg also is saying. You've got a lot of critics to her saying like, yeah, you're thinking we're all doomed, you're creating negativity, when I think actually it's just creating a sense of emergency personally, but it's, yeah, you hear me.
Yeah. We have to be realistic and we have to create that sense of emergency. But I actually also think that we have a responsibility to maintain hope and a responsibility to look for and to find and to highlight the kind of positive future that we can also create. If we don't talk about that positive future, it's not going to happen. There is a principle that comes from appreciative inquiry. That is, in a way, the stories that you tell each other, the future that you talk about is also going to be the one that's most likely to come about. So we need to not give up on that. We need to talk about that. We need to then also balance that with a dose of realism and a dose of emergency. But I think you can do both and you can hold that balance.
Last questions. Do you have 2 books that everyone you think should read?
Sure, I have lots of books that I think everyone should read. But
you can send me more. I put the list on the website.
Okay, if I maybe highlight, well, I might have 3 if that's okay. I won't go too far, but one is a book that came out just over 10 years ago, and I remember reading at the time. It's very simple, and it's called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And I think it was the book that really put inequality on the map. And the thesis of the book is very simple. It talks about the fact that inequality is correlated with all kinds of negative outcomes for society. and that more equal societies, have much better outcomes across a whole range of different things: health, well-being, mental health, crime, trust, etc. But the really fascinating thing is that you might think that is because, obviously, if a society is more equal, then the people at the bottom of that society are, for example, happier or healthier or have better well-being. The really exciting thing is that it's not actually about just the bottom half of that distribution. It is also about the people at the top of that distribution. They are also happier and healthier and so on as well. So that goes a little bit back to what I was saying earlier around changing the story and collectively getting to a place of well-being. The second book, which I'm sure you may have heard of, is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. I think that's really exciting because it shows us some different ways of thinking. It takes some of these old ways of thinking that are based on what I would say are these unhealthy values that we've taken as being true, or doctrine for a long time, and says actually there are other ways of thinking about this. So it's an exercise in kind of illustrating what these new values might be able to lead us towards. And then thirdly, just because I think it's a fascinating question, there's a book by the philosopher called Michael Sandel, which is called What Money Can't Buy. And again, it goes, because it's at that slightly more philosophical, but very practical examples that he gives, but it relates directly to this kind of idea of values and different values and what are the values that we currently hold in our economy. So those would be my top 3 tips: the spirit level, donut economics, and what money can't buy.
Thanks a lot for your time, Tom. It was really insightful and interesting to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julien, for having me on the podcast.
None of this is rhetoric, and none of it is hysteria. It is fact.